We're pretty excited about this session on the topic of should we be using more Australian-bred Angus genetics. As I said, it's a topic of much discussion in the industry. So we've pulled together a panel of 6 people with, I think, a range of perspectives on this. There'll be some similarities and some differences in their perspectives on this, I'm sure. So on the panel we have Dr. Peter Amer, who is a consultant quantitative geneticist, very well respected internationally for his work, not just in the beef sector, but across many species of livestock in the area of genetics. And Peter's actually has done some objective analysis of the structure of the Angus breed in Australia and is going to share some of that information as part of his comments. Harry Lawson is an Angus breeder. Lawson's Angus, a long family tradition of breeding Angus cattle, which I'm sure most of you are aware of. And Harry's been obviously very involved in the Angus breed internationally and been involved in the use of both Australian bred sires and of course international sires as well. Brad Gilmour from Emu Creek is a commercial producer. He's also a cooperator herd in our Angus sire benchmarking program. So we very much look forward to hearing the contributions of Brad. Nigel Semmens from Genetics Australia. Nigel is a beef genetics consultant for Genetics Australia and very much involved in obviously in the artificial breeding sector. Carel Teseling, who is the breed development manager for Angus Australia, who would be known to most of you. And Dick Weil, and apologise to Dick and to the audience that Dick's name as a typo missed out on being put on the program, but we certainly welcome Dick as part of the panel as well. Dick is a very well known and respected breeding consultant to breeders of Angus cattle and other cattle throughout Australia, and in fact my time, Dick's a close friend of mine. We go way back to the days when we both worked together at Trangie back in the early 80s, and when I first met Dick, he'd just returned from University of Illinois, where he'd won the Angus National Judging Competition and the award to University of Illinois. So Dick is certainly a product of our, we claim anyway, Dick is a product of our Angus Youth program as well. So these 6 people will provide us some insights. We're very fortunate though to have Fiona Myers, who is volunteered to facilitate this session. Fiona is a journalist with Weekly Times, and I'd introduce Fiona to take over from here and facilitate this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. This is the graveyard shift, so I'm going to start it with a joke. And I've got to remember it. What did the green grape say to the purple grape? Breathe, you idiot, breathe! My kids liked it better than you, clearly. Okay, there's nothing new in the Australian Angus breed using international genetics. I am old enough to remember how Scotch Cap dominated the pedigrees of Angus cattle in the early 1990s. More recently, of course, new design and future directions' influence on the Australian herd has been nothing short of phenomenal. Is it a coincidence that the rise of Angus in Australia has coincided with the influence of these 2 sires? Could the breed have done it without international genetics? Can it continue to grow without the input of international sires? Australia's Angus herd is certainly growing, and that rate of growth in terms of numbers of animals is envied by most other breeds in this nation. But perhaps it's good to put these numbers into perspective. Angus certainly dominate Australia's temperate cattle regions, and some may say we now have enough records and enough genetics to look within our own Australian herd to lift productivity. Yet, on the world stage, we are relatively small fry. Thanks to Google and Peter Parnell, I've put together some figures which may offer some perspective. At the end of September last year, the American Angus Society had registered 315,000 cattle and had 20 million records. New Zealand, which I found some stats out this morning, has registered 25,000 has 25,000 cows registered and hundreds of thousands of records. Despite huge growth in the stud Australian Angus scene, Australian Angus registered 67,500. That's compared to 315,000 in the US. So 67,500 in Australia and has 1.6 million records. It is in this light that I would like to introduce our guest speakers and our topic: should we be using more Australian bred Angus genetics? Our guest speakers will each offer a brief, 5-minute rundown on their thoughts. And I do have a bell, which I may not use that loudly. Our guest speakers will offer a brief 5-minute rundown on their thoughts, and then we obviously welcome discussion around this topic, which I'm sure will bring out some really interesting views. So our first speaker is Mr. Peter Amer. Thanks, Peter. Do you want them to sit or to stand? Up here.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you, Fiona, for the introduction. So, as was alluded to, I've been looking at some of the Angus data, the pedigree data really, and breeding values over the history of the breed in a fairly extensive analysis over a year ago. And the idea was to try and understand what factors are going on inside the breed that are contributing to genetic progress. So this is just a snapshot of some of those results. Also, actually, before I go into those results, I just want to sort of map out what I think maybe the Australian industry is investing in the US genetics on an annual basis. So if we take, say, 60,000 calves registered a year, and if 25% of those went to foreign bulls, 1.4 inseminations per registered AI calf, 20,000 units of semen would therefore be bought at $40 each, say, then you might be spending about $800,000 a year on imported semen. So that is money that is going from Australia to AI companies in the US that maybe could be used for developing the breed within Australia. So that's one point. This next slide shows a plot of the genetic trend over time for sort of an average of the 4 main Angus indexes. So back here in the sort of 70s and 80s, trends are accelerating up to the current quite steep slope that we're on right now. The idea behind this graph is that it's divided up into where the genetic progress has actually come from. So on this list here, the different colours respond to different herds that have made a big contribution to the breed that we can see in the pedigree. They've sired lots of, so bulls from those herds have sired lots of calves in the industry, and those calves have been good and contributed to the genetic trend. So down the bottom here, these bottom 3 countries, they're actually countries, so where the genetic progress has come from introducing genetics from other countries. And this country A here happens to be the USA, so this big blue area is the contribution to the Australian Angus genetic trend that has come from importing good bulls into Australia. So obviously it's been a massive impact, particularly through this steep time. It is tailing off a wee bit, and what we're seeing is here now there's some key herds emerging, and then the rest of the herds are also contributing. So an important point here, there are a few herds that are contributing a lot to genetic trend by the recording effort, getting top animals and disseminating those animals widely in Australia. So key message here, the USA has been a major contributor to genetic progress in the history of the Angus breed in Australia, at least since the 1970s. Another point that came out of that analysis is if we look at the index values of the progeny of various types of sires, this dotted line here is foreign sires, so they are better, mainly US sires. Then the dotted line, not getting my dot there, that dotted line there is the merit of progeny in herds that have been born to sires that were from other herds. Okay, so initially the outside sires weren't any better than the homebred sires, all Australian born, but that has started to diverge and people are now using better sires from outside their own herd. The other point here is that they're catching up, that there's a divergence here between the USA genetics and the Australian genetics. Also, this dotted line here represents the pick of the crop from the top. They're basically progeny of the top USA sires. And if we start to be more selective and pick out leading breeders that have had a big contribution to the Angus breed, we can actually see that their genetic trends are up now with the same level of genetic merit as the USA genetics. So the summary of my talk is that Australian Angus breeders spending maybe 800 grand a year on semen, and for a narrow gene pool that is maybe not really that special anymore. So yes, the American genetics has made a big contribution. Maybe now you've caught up and it's time to get on with doing your own thing.
Thanks, Peter. Our next speaker will be Harry Lawson from Lawson's Angus. Thanks, Harry.
Bit shorter. Thought you might have been cold on feet, Dick. That's why you left off. But it's good you're here.
Couldn't fit through the door, mate.
He always gives me heaps, so nice to give it back. Yeah, thanks for the invitation today. I think it is a really pertinent question. It's going to be good to discuss this in a bit of detail. I think, like a lot of you today, are very proud Australian breeders. So don't take my comments as being sort of too harsh on Australian breeders, but especially when you look at our racehorse mates this week and what goes on in those industries, I think we should be very proud of the work we have done in sort of building a database from scratch in the mid-80s. So I think, it's a great thing what has been achieved in Australia. I just think, we need to make sure we haven't got the blinkers on. Where's my controls? Only got 5 minutes. I just did a quick sort this week on the top $100 index bulls, and I thought it was high, so I did a while back. We didn't realise it was 87 out of the top 100 were actually Australian bred bulls. That's just on the long-fed CAAB index. So I'm not saying that that's the only indicator of superior performance, but that's probably a good overshot, and it's quite surprising that it is that high, for me anyway. So yeah, assuming that the CAAB long-fed is a good indicator of commercial profitability, then the answer is pretty simple on the surface, that we should be using more Australian bulls. So I should probably say I didn't sort that between APR, didn't weed out any carriers, but it's more to still illustrate a point that proportionally it's huge. Talking to Peter Parnell recently and saying, my question, part of what I think we should talk about today too, is not just the Australian, whether we should be using Australian bulls, but is it time to assess these dollar indexes? Do we all still think that they currently reflect the sort of selection priorities that have been in place? We shouldn't assume, it's a changing world. We heard some really good stuff from Kent today, and things change, so we need to make sure that we're not just being dictated by geneticists that aren't in the real world at Armidale. So my question was, why did so many Australian bulls appear in the top 100? The three main things I came up with were really genetics. Like, Australian breeders should pat themselves on their back. They have done a massive job in using information. You could argue that we are a smaller ship, not like the Titanic in the US, that we can adapt using a lot of AIET. We've potentially more focused. We've had a very strong sort of feedlot industry, which has really given us clear market signals, and possibly we've reacted quicker and made some very good progress. So I think we should be positive about that. Technical, I think it's time once again to review things. My gut feeling, without having the time to research, is that breed plan is discounting the US bulls. Like, I personally don't think it's possible that there aren't more US bulls in that top 100. So I think we really need to pull that apart. That's a technical issue, and I think Peter probably talked to him a while back. We need to produce some evidence for that, but it just doesn't seem right. The other possible reason is diverging breeding goals. Like, have we gone a different way to the US? Is dollar beef pushing the US one way, and we've done such a good job at selecting for long-fed that we've swamped the US? I doubt that as well, although there potentially is some differences in our breeding objectives. I'll be the first to admit that. So maybe, look at, I'm not sure what the correlation is between, dollar beef focuses more on post-weaning sort of feedlot carcass values, doesn't take into account birth weight, mature cow size. What is the correlation, Peter, roughly with dollar beef? But it'd be reasonably high, you would think, given the weighting on. Carel should be able to answer that one.
You reckon? Wait until it's my turn.
Okay. How much time have we got? Couple of minutes. That was Peter's slide too. I think, so I pinched that. I got that from Peter Parnell, so I didn't delve into your bag and grab it, but a bit of plagiarism never hurts. But that just shows, look at the massive impact from US genetics. And the next slide's the same. If you look at, this is 2005. So I think Peter's summary of that was in 2005, 69% of the genes in Australian progeny came from US sires. So a simple point there is that don't forget how we got here. Don't be blinkered and say that we're all pat ourselves on the back and we just use Australian bulls naively. We actually got here because we used US genetics really smartly. Now there is an increase in the use of Australian bred AI sires and natural mating sires, and I think that's what we're here to talk about. My view is statistically it's not possible for Australian breeders to produce all the top sires in the world. It's also not possible for individual herds to produce the top 10 bulls in the world. So whenever I pick up a catalogue and they're all reference sires are all homebred bulls, to me the simple thing is they're not really sourcing the best bulls, they're using their own bulls for it might be a good message to clients, but statistically it's not possible for any individual herd to breed all their own bulls top sires each year. So that's a simple way I look at catalogues, whether you're in the US or Australia, New Zealand, or you look at what bulls are they assessing or using by AI, what proportion of outside. It's a really good way to get a quick snapshot. This is different again to saying we can't keep pace with the top herds in the world. Like, I think the information to me says that we are. I think Peter's information there was really good. We probably have narrowed the gap and we're tracking pretty well. I see different, when you flick through those top 100 bulls, I'd argue that probably long fed is putting too much emphasis on carcass. We still need to maintain direct, indirect calving ease, maternal efficiency, feed efficiency is going to become more important. So those things I think we also need to keep in mind. So I'm going off the track here. Our goals are simply to lost my speech. To really focus on what our commercial clients need and keep them competitive in a global beef market, which is probably what Peter's saying. We have narrowed the gap, but we need to make sure we stay competitive. Like in the world of Twitter, and I actually left my phone in the car, so I didn't get on the phone, and I'm not a Twitter or a technology guru, but I always come back to simple formulas, and Matthias, this is a fair way from 50k, but the basic genetic formulas haven't changed in the last 100 years. Selection, genetic gain is really driven off selection differential, how superior parents are, times for the heritability divided by the generation interval. So basically using superior genetics with heritable traits, keeping younger superior animals, you make faster progress. Really simple formula, but it drives genetic progress whether you're in chickens, chooks, or wherever you are in the world. So my biggest thing, hope is Eliza here today? I got my numbers from Eliza, so there's a bit of discrepancy between your numbers, but 310,000 calves in the US versus 54,000 in Australia. So from a statistical genetic gain point of view, we're crazy to narrow. As soon as we narrow population, we narrow genetic gain. So that's probably my simple message. If we drop the US out altogether, we reduce our effective population by 85%. If we drop APR out, we reduce it by, 92%. So effective population is a really key part of genetic progress. It's, providing a size selection is correct, and we have very good global information to do that. population sizes, everything. How long have we got? That's about it. So quickly, the impacts of only use Australian bulls: reduced genetic gain, increasing inbreeding through loss of diversity, increased potential for recessive disorders, inbreeding depression, reduced fertility and fitness traits. So, we've already got competitors trying to say we should be using crossbreeding. The more we narrow the gene pool, the more crossbreeding will become a viable option. Problems of using overseas bulls, accessing semen could become a bigger issue if people like Nigel and other ABS and other companies don't get support from Australian breeders. US companies will stop collecting bulls for Australia potentially. Nigel might come on that. Other problems, relying on third-party advice. It's easy to go and look at bulls in Australia and get whether they're a good thing or not, looking at daughters, feet, structure. So there's possibly more risk using US bulls, and difference in breeding objectives. So that was about it from me.
Thanks very much, Harry. I'd now like to get, I think we've got a fantastic panel and we're very lucky to have the broad depth of information from such a range of people involved in the Angus industry. The next one is Brad Gilmour, who looks suspiciously nervous of me and my bell. So he's got 5 minutes to talk as a producer perspective. Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, Fiona. It's pretty daunting for a commercial producer to sit up here and try and talk about Angus genetics to professionals. But we have a family business that with no outside income for since we started. So it's really important to us to maximise our returns. So in a self-replacing herd, we need to, what David McConaughey said this morning, we really need to understand the market we're supplying. Down here? Yep. Okay. So just a brief background on what we're doing. We've got 1,000 spring calving cows, and that's in September, October. So we only calve for 6 weeks, that's including our AI period. As you can see, we're in high rainfall country and we finish our steers, but we're not glued into that. It's obviously season and price dependent, and if we see a good price, we're happy to take it at a younger age or a lighter weight. There's only Marg and myself for the entire labour units we've got, so nothing's getting done at home today. And we've been completely recording all our progeny, sire and dam, and their performance through their lifetime for about the last 25 years. So, being a commercial producer, we really love our females, and I think we've probably identified a couple of good female lines that we think on the world stage are doing the job for Australia. So we like good breeders that get better with age. They're no fuss, just keep doing the job. We also love young breeders that calve early, bounce back, always present well, and it's good Australian genetics, we think. So, given that we've looked at the females, the sire can obviously have a greater impact on the breed, and we think we've got a winner here. That this one's well muscled, resilient, and not only that, it could solve our wild dog problem at the same time. So, considering the question, following on from this, oh, sorry, missed one. We'll just wait, Fiona. Sonia, should we be using more Australian genetics? There's some things we need to, missed the slide there, consider before we know which track we're going to go down. Whether we want in growth, muscle, marbling, whether we want a grade MSA. So that's on the steer side, but in a self-replacing herd, there's important traits: fertility, calving ease, structure, temperament, and all these things that make up a good herd. And it's something we can do, having them in Australia, is We can jump in the car, we can go and look at the whole package. Not only can we see the bull, we can see the siblings, the sisters, the daughters, the udders, all those sorts of things that are absolutely critical. So no matter how good they look in a commercial herd, it's important to identify those unproductive females. Doesn't matter what they look like, doesn't matter what their pedigree is. If that calf that you're weaning that's going to make you the money is no good, chop her head off. Don't sell her to next door and go, oh, I've got these 10 good cows. Chop her head off, because that will come back to bite you. You've just ruined your brand. So we always sell our low-performing cows for slaughter. So I've just got a photo of some of the cohort 2 cows and calves. They've just been AI'd this one day. And, yep, that's them going. I don't know where all that feed's gone. It's just somebody else ate it. So just in finishing, we're trying to continually... I'm not Steven Spielberg either, so it's a bit jerky. It'll be better once I stop walking. To ensure that the bulls we're going to use are going to meet the criteria that suits our property and under our management structure. So I think people need to, before they use, whether it's Australian or US or wherever it's from, I think it's more important that we need to select genetics that suit our production systems, be it from Australia and or overseas, and suit our production system, yep, and suit the way we, and know that market you're trying to fulfil. So know what the feedlot wants, know what Coles want, but once you've identified that that's the market that suits your property, suits your country, then it's a lot easier to go and source the right genetics. That's it, Fiona.
I think Brad needs a bit more congratulations for being the humble producer who produced a little clip up there. It's fantastic. Though I did notice Miranda Kerr has chose a US sire for the father of her children. Yeah, that's right. So I don't know which message you're coming from there. Our next speaker, and thank you for keeping to time, everyone. Our next speaker is the most appropriately named person for his job. He works for Genetics Australia. His name is Nigel Semmens, and he's going to give us his presentation. Thanks, Nigel.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here today. I'm just going to give a little bit of a brief overview from the AI industry's perspective. Some of the statistics in regards to semen sales of Australian and US sires, and also what my own opinion is of what we should do. I am a little bit biased towards the US product. I've been marketing it in Australia for over 13 years. We've always had good support from our US counterparts, but as a Australian farmer-owned cooperative, part of our program is also to grow our domestic product lineup in Australia, and part of the challenges of that is to find a product range that's going to suit the market, be diverse enough in its pedigree, and have the figures and indexes that producers ask us for when we get our phone calls, inquiries at days like this for AI sires. So, this is statistics from the National Herd Improvement Association. They've been running a semen sales survey only for the past 3 years, so it would have been nice to have some older data to go back to. But this data here shows imported Angus semen and domestic Angus semen sales in Australia in the financial year of 2011-2012. So it's pretty much even. Now that data there is from the main AI companies: Genetics Australia, ABS, CMX, Agrigenes, CRV, Sedgwick and Outer. Well, they're all members of the National Herd Improvement Association and submit their data. So I've, the next slide here, I've added in a little bit of extra figures to account for roughly what I've discussed with a few other people, that we've added in about 15,000 additional units on the domestic side to include private semen sales, whether or not it be from some of the major studs that sell their own semen in Australia, to individual breeders, and some of the bulls that Dick Whale sells. So, it's not an exact figure, but we seem to think that that's probably pretty close to the mark. So, by including that on the semen sales side of it, you would probably say that the Australian Angus semen is about 56% now. 50% of all the calves registered were side by AI. So there's a total registration of 67,000 progenies, so that gives us about 33,700 progeny registered that are AI side. So if we're using the similar percentage to the semen sales, that would give us about 18,000, nearly 19,000 side by Australian bull, Australian, and 14,800 US. Should we be using more Australian bred Angus genetics? In my opinion, I say no, but then also, should we be using more imported genetics? I also say no. You might say I'm sitting on the fence a bit, but I think from my point of view, when I interact with a lot of breeders, everybody's got a different story to tell when they ask about what AI size they should be using. My point of view is you should select the best genetics for your program, regardless of their origin. That's probably the best thing. We've got EBVs, EPDs to select from. We've got 50k data to use now. So, all these other markets now, you can get a pretty good idea of bulls from Australia, the UK, New Zealand, USA, based on their data. Use the EBVs and visual appraisal, and seek advice from your peers or other professionals in the industry about bulls. I think that's probably one of the biggest things people should do is talk to other people about the bulls, study the pedigrees, see if it's going to fit your program, and invest in your program by going, if you can, go and inspect the bulls that you might want to use, whether or not it's in Australia or New Zealand or the US. You can do a trip overseas for the cost of a bull if you're in the bull selling market, and I'd say you get a pretty good return on that investment. If you can't, get in the car and travel around the country and go and look at progeny by bulls, whether they're Australian bulls or imported bulls. If you can, meet the breeder who's bred a bull that you're thinking of using, understand their program and their breeding objectives, and if they're in line with what you want to do, then go ahead and use it. If you see that their program's going this way and you're going that way, then maybe it's not the bull to use. Everything else might seem right, the figures and the pedigree, but you've really just got to stick to your own breeding objectives and select the bulls, regardless of their origin, that are going to suit your program. And I think for another topic in the future, or even later today, is how can we all as an industry work together to export more Angus genetics around the world. As an example, last year the USA alone, they exported 1.7 million units of semen just to Brazil. So, if we can get a little bit of that slice of that pie, it can only benefit our industry. Thanks a lot.
Okay, Nigel, thank you very much for the work you did in preparing that, and a great insight into the semen sales. I was surprised at the level of Australian semen sales, so that's good to see. Our next speaker is Carel Teseling. He's warned me that I need to put a technology alert on him. So I've got that bell again. You've got 5 minutes.
Not at all. Thank you, Vienna. Well, I chose not to have slides because otherwise I might be just too long, so I'm really going to keep it short. I think the previous 4 speakers have certainly already addressed a lot of the issues, and I probably just want to touch base on what we've done 10 years ago, just about A few months later now, we've done a workshop where we had some of our prominent breeders come and speak and talk and discuss and work with some of the prominent geneticists about specifically this issue. And I must say, at that stage, we've used a lot more American semen and very little Australian semen. And so we had a workshop where we tried to say, okay, what can we do? How can we do things differently? And in that workshop, we got to the conclusion that we have to promote Australian semen more, the use of Australian bulls, and there's been reasons for that. Because our system, we felt, was doing a pretty good job, but our animals just didn't get the airtime. And the other day I went back preparing for this. I had a look at some of the, or at least one semen catalogue, and it was not Nigel's company. But in that catalogue there were 35 bulls, and 4 of those bulls, that was in 2004, 4 of those bulls were Australian bulls. Then we've run the Young Sire program, which was really a system where we employed and used Bob Guest as a consultant to help us with Bob Dent as well. Going around the country, we got members to identify some of their promising bulls, where they felt that this is really going to be bulls that they would feel comfortable in trying to get into the industry. So we've had them physically inspected, we've looked at the figures, we looked at genetic diversity, all of those different areas to see if these animals would suit. And also then what we had is unfortunately, ideally we should have had commercial bull buyers that we can put those in commercial herds, but that wasn't feasible. So we actually got seed stock herds that were prepared to cooperate with us and use some of this semen and really to give them a little bit of exposure. Initially, we of course had the semen companies very annoyed with us. They were really people saying that we're trying to take over and we want to kill their business and whatever. And we continue to say that we're responding to members asking for more Australian genetics. And we've run that program for 3 years. By the end of those 3 years, we got to a point where when we contacted members and say, listen, do you have bulls to nominate? They said, no, because the semen companies already contacted us. After those 3 years, in 2008, that same semen company that had only 4 bulls had 15 bulls in their catalogue. That's Australian bulls, and out of the 40, just over 40. So it was a huge increase from about less than 10% to more than 30% of their catalogue were Australian. And I think that was fantastic. Baseline to my stories, I think that we actually at the moment are at a good level. I don't think that we all of a sudden now have to push Australian genetics a lot more or push US genetics more. I think at the moment it's fantastic that we are actually looking at the genetic merit of cattle and selecting on those. Of course, there's 2 sides to it always, that you have to look at your genetic diversity. That's the one side of it, but also you have to look at performance, and you need to balance those, and that's the important thing, and I think that's what we all should continue to do, is to make sure that we are balancing performance versus genetic diversity. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl, for that very accessible technical talk. Our final speaker who missed the program, but you can't miss him in person, is Dick Whale, and he will be our final presentation of 5 minutes, and then we'll be looking to the floor for questions.
Thanks, Fiona, and thanks for the invitation. I bought my watch because I'm scared of this bloody bell, so... Some people that know me would endorse that. Well, I think the panel's covered it pretty well. Pete, Harry and Nigel, basically, good genetics is good from anywhere in the world, and we don't want to lose sight of that. We can see that there's nearly 5 times as many cattle registered in the US. We just need to evaluate the cattle, and I think possibly we shouldn't believe as gospel because it's in a semen catalogue it's a good bull. That's not criteria for the best bulls in the industry, in my belief. I just had a visit to the States just before just before Easter this year and attended a sale with 24 different sire lines in that sale catalogue, and there was only one that we thought was acceptable. Obviously, a lot of those bulls were in semen catalogues. And there was one very popular bull with 19 sons in the first pen of that sale. I went in there with a specific purpose of walking every one of those bulls and see if I was happy with the way they moved. I came out with 2, and when I looked at those 2 closely, I came out with 1. So we pretty quickly dispatched that sire line to the bin. Just on my big worry with the current indexes in Australia is a lack of genetic diversity, and Harry raised that. I think we do need to review indexes and make sure that we're not leading the breed up the garden path, and Harry certainly raised that. I just did a little search the other day on the top 15 bulls on the long-fed CAAB index with 25 or more progeny. 3 are full brothers, another 2 are full brothers, another 3 are out of 1 cow. So 8 of the 15 are very closely related, and the average inbreeding coefficient of those bulls was 6.13%. And I've certainly heard people at sales this autumn say, is 146 high enough long-fed index, which is the top 1% of the breed? And if that's driving the breed, we can certainly get up the garden path. Just remember what the commercial customer requirement is, and Richard Eldershaw's looking very closely at me here, but the commercial customer's requirement is to get longevity in his bulls, longevity in his females, calving ease direct and maternal, and adequate growth for his target market, which will be determined in some environments by your nutrition and how much feed you might put down your throat. There are customer requirements for saleable red meat yield and marbling for some markets, but that's a customer requirement, not actually a commercial. And you, as being in the seed stock industry, that's what your commercial guy wants when he buys a bull off you. Okay? The export semen thing's interesting. Nigel raised that. We've actually just put a bull on collection now for export to the US. Would you believe we have to have that bull in there 2 months prior and 2 months post collection to be tested for TB, which we eradicated from this country in the late 70s, 80s. That's a requirement for the US market now. There is a lot of pseudo bans on us almost getting cattle, and that's obviously a big expense when you've got to have that extra 2 months on pre and post collection to collect a bull for that market, and you know, frankly, it's a trade barrier. With my clients at the moment, I'd say last year, I did look it up briefly, but we used probably 65% of our product was domestic product. I did sums, and I won't put this up, but several years ago, and I'm sure it'll be the same now, 70% of sun side in my clients' herds by what I call hierarchy bulls, what we knew how they would perform, made sale bulls. And they made at auction $1,000 more than the hot new bulls or the unproven sires. So about 59% of those made sale bulls, and I was at that time the culls were calculated at $1,000 return. The best young yearling bulls in my clients' herds were used to back up the AI programs. Some of those were running 2 cycles, some 1 cycle. Admittedly, their progeny was significantly younger. Only 39% of those made sale bulls. There was another $1,000 back. So the high accuracy bulls were worth $2,000 more than those best of their drop yearling bulls. So that says to me that you use high accuracy bulls, you know how they'll perform, and they will make you money. Unfortunately, we're what I call rainbow breeders. The hot new bull always looks better, and we tend to chase And I'm as bad as anyone. I'm always looking for that great new outcross bull that's going to change the world. And the bull we used last year that's got 2-year-old daughters and they've all got in calf, he's the progeny are a bit tight in behind the shoulder, or they show a little bit of excess white, or we're always running away from what's good, looking for something magic. We shouldn't be rainbow breeders. If we've got good genetics and we know what they'll do and we know what the deficiencies they'll do, we should learn to manage those and continue to develop new genetics by all means, but we shouldn't lose sight of the good genetics that are working for us at the moment. Thank you very much.
Right, Dick. I didn't have to get the bell out for him. Okay, now it's everyone else's turn. I don't know whether anyone would like to start the questions. I think we've had a fascinating discussion to date, and I'm looking to the floor to see if there's any questions. I'm happy to start the discussion unless I can see someone who wants to. Maybe I'll address this, and you can address your question to anyone in the panel. I'd ask you to identify yourself, and I'm looking for some questions from, don't you all hide, you younger people. I'm looking for some questions from some of the younger ones. I'm looking for some questions from some younger people as well. But perhaps if you could put your name and where you come from and whether you're a commercial or a stud stock producer or someone else associated with the industry, that'd be great. So if anyone, I'll start the questions if you like, and anyone in the panel, I might start with you, Dick. What do you think the effect of using Australian-only bulls would have on the progress of Angus in Australia if we were only to use Angus genetics?
Well,
Australian genetics.
Yeah, I think I probably covered that a little bit in that inbreeding coefficient with the current indexes. I think we'd continue to use narrowing pool. Incidentally, those 15 bulls, I might add, were full of two sire lines, Future Direction and 036 and his son 1407. I think, with that comment I had made this year, is 146 index, and that was a comment actually Nigel passed me from a client of his. But I think to give you an example, that I did the analysis on a sale here this year and drew the line at $135 index. Every bull over $135 made $2,000 more than every bull under 135 index. Now, does that mean that the bulls at 130 were inferior? I don't think it does. But in that particular herd, they're preaching, that's the message they're getting out. And as we go to more corporate agriculture, it's very easy to put up on a board that 146 is better than the breed average of 90, what is it, Carel, 97 or whatever it is. That looks very good on a board, but if our indexes are wrong, and we've got too much weighting on, say, growth and IMF, and not enough on some other traits that'll have function and form as far as fertility goes, we might be down the garden path. Okay?
Got a question in here.
Just to follow up to that, some years ago we had a postgraduate from Armidale do an assessment of the inbreeding coefficient of the Angus seed stock industry, and that time was 2%. I'm wondering, do we know what it is currently? I know what Dick said about half a dozen bulls, 10 bulls, but about the whole industry. Carel, I think you most likely.
Peter and then Carl.
Yep. So the actual inbreeding coefficient, so that is the inbreeding in individual animals, is still around 2%. It hasn't increased very much, and I think that's because breeders do a good job of not mating close relatives. But the effective population size, which is sort of how related all the animals are to each other if they were mated at random, that has really dropped substantially in the Angus population. So where that might have been, in sort of geneticist jargon, 400 effective population size 10 years ago, it's now about 100. And I'm not sure what the global Holstein population is. It's maybe 40 or 50, and that is really, really close. So it's low enough. I guess on this whole issue of needing to go to the USA for genetic diversity, I'm not 100% convinced of that, because I guess I imagine that a lot of the genetic disorders that are in the Angus breed came from the US, that they are probably staring down the barrel of all the same issues that Australia is. Despite their big population, they use a lot of artificial insemination. I imagine their top bulls are also from a relatively narrow set of lines. So I don't really see evidence of sourcing genetics from the USA as actually having generated genetic diversity for Australia. So it would be good to get a bit more debate on that particular issue.
Well, I think Peter covered that whole area pretty well about the size of the effective population, really. I would probably be more interested in Nigel's comments about, so if we say that we have a problem with our effective population size, what would his opinion be on the US? Because, I don't know, either him or Dick would probably have the best idea about that. Could you make a comment on that?
Yeah, I think there is not as narrow sire lines in the US as what people think. You know, combining all the AI companies that sell semen in the US, there'd probably be, you know, a choice of over 300 Angus bulls at any one time that you could select from, and they have a much larger AI industry than what we have here. They got customers that just want heifer bulls. They've got customers that are focused on their dollar beef indexes. So I actually think that they have a more varied line of sires to choose from than what a lot of people realise. I think that in Australia, where Australian breeders are very focused on the long fed index, and there's just those condensed sire lines that are going to get people to where they want to be. I think if people were willing to take a step back, and you know, there's nothing wrong with using a bull that's in the top 10% of the breed for an index, rather than looking for a bull that's, you know, the extremity or in the top 5 or 3%. If people are willing to take a step back from that, I think the choice of sire lines that they would have greatly increases, especially with the bulls from the US. So, you know, their market is quite different to ours here, and you know, I'd probably say that you know, their industry about 3 or 4 years ago, probably about the same time as the recessive disorders sort of came out, they took they were just dollar B focused. Everybody you spoke to in America, everything they said was just dollar B, dollar B, dollar B index. And with the recessives coming out, their industry took a big turn. Everybody took a lot of those guys over there took a big step back from it. They focused more on growth, and you know, they aimed at trying to keep their dollar B where they could still make money, but they just stepped back from chasing the extremity. And you know, over the last 3 or 4 years, I'd say, you know, the number of bulls that are being used there now, their sire lines has opened up quite a lot compared to what it would have been, you know, 5 or 6 years ago.
Dick, did you want to make a comment as well?
I'll just use the example of Montana. I think Montana's an interesting state, and probably the most diverse of any from where the US industry is. And they're a state that's very focused on the cow unit, the maternal sort of, and they use very markedly different genetics to the rest of the US in a lot of instances. But I asked last June over there one particular breed. I said, does your customers take any notice of carcass data or any IMF raw scan data? And he said yes, in the negative. So they're actually perceiving it as being bad. So that leads to genetic diversity. Whether it's good or bad, certainly from my point of view, it wasn't good. But the other interesting thing about that state, the most prominent breeders probably in that state are the Sitz brothers, Sitz Angus, and they bred a bull called, was initially called Sitz Bull Durham, who was by 1407 the prominent sire here, and they changed his name to Bull Durham because they didn't want anyone in the state to know they'd used an 036 derivative in a 1407 son. And then ABS took the bull on and changed his name back to New Design because it was more profitable for them to have it than the name in the US. So there is quite a bit of genetic diversity there. The best sale this year in the US has been Shaft Angus Valley in North Dakota, and all our high-selling progeny, both male and female, were by a bull that's in the top 1% for high birth weight and top 1% for poor calving ease. So there is a fair bit of genetic diversity there, and that sale averaged $12,800 for 437 bulls.
Well, clearly those people who buy those bulls don't mind getting up at night and pulling calves, which I've got better things to do at night than pull calves. And I'm not
Well,
going
it
to tell
just
you what that
shows
is.
it. I use that as an example of the diversity.
Yeah, that's right.
There is a lot more diversity over there than we have here.
Thanks, Dick. Now we've got a question at the back with Mark. Can you identify yourself?
Sinclair Monroe, Bournemouth Angus Stud, Bingra, Northern New South Wales. Question for someone that can answer it. Structural EBVs, we've been developing them in the breed, slowly developing them, and docility EBVs as well. Do you think we can somehow incorporate those traits, or do we think they're important for one, which many of us do? Do you think we can incorporate them into the indexes in Australia and possibly America?
Carl, do you want to take that?
I could perhaps try to answer that one. I would certainly not try to answer it for America, Sinclair, because they do their own thing, mate. But for us, I think one really need to look at the economic value, because that is what we try to do with the dollar indexes. We try to work out the economic value of the trait that we're looking at. And I think it's a lot more complex than just putting a dollar value on it. So at the moment, we really have to look at what the impact is, how much do you actually lose. And in our whole process, the dollar indexes came up a couple of times now, and it seems like there are people that are concerned about the dollar indexes and how we handle that, how we redetermine the emphasis that we need to put on different traits. And I must say that we are using industry people to help us with that. So traditionally we've used people like Richard Eldershaw and some of the abattoir people to give us what is a certain trait like marbling or any of the female fertility traits worth to a commercial person, a commercial producer. So we are trying to put that in there. So ultimately we will have to look at what is the economic importance. Structure, sure, is important, but can we measure it better in longevity by rather having a measure that we can say structure would impact on females that they will leave the herd earlier, and therefore it has an economic impact through the associated trait rather than the front claw set is whatever. So those are some of the principles we would have to look at, and that's really the answer. We need to look at the economic impact of it. Can I give you an answer today? No, but we would certainly look at those things and try to get a feel for it.
Can I just then direct that question to Brad and then Harry, or Brad first if I can. Just how important would it be for having factors like longevity and structural soundness and docility built into some sort of index that would help you to take a look at a bull catalogue and get a good feeling for all of that built into an index rather than just IMF and retail beef yield and things? How good would that be in an index?
Well, it's certainly critical to a commercial producer, and that's one of the advantages I said earlier about you can get in the car and go and drive and look at the udder, look at the temperament, look at the feet. And especially where we are in high rainfall zone, there's virtually no wear on the feet at all, so they have to be genetically perfect. Because we're in that area, we're surrounded by dairies, and you only have to look at their female production, and it's just absolutely atrocious. An old cow in a dairy herd in our area is probably 3.5 years old. She's only had 2 lactations. Some of those have only had 1. She's failed to get in calf. They just keep milking her, and she falls out of the herd. The cost of their replacements, I've got a neighbour, goes out and buys an entire another herd every year to top up his herd. That's what their fallout rate on their females are like, so we've got to run as far away from that as we can.
Harry, did you want to speak as well?
Just quickly, I think those traits are obviously critical and they're important, but I think the indexes should be based on sort of economic traits. Like I think if you put subjective traits in like structure and docility, so I think you can continue to develop those as separate values, but I think if you compound those dollar indexes, which really should be based on objective information, I think some of the things like particularly structure probably more influenced by environmental factors too. Like one, it's subjective to score. The variance distribution is greater in sort of areas like northwest Tassie or higher rainfall parts of New Zealand. So depending on your environment, you get very different outcomes. Cattle that look perfect in some granite type soils, you put them on sandy wet soils and they completely change. So I just think you would lose. I think the indexes, I think we should argue about what those traits and the weightings of the traits like IMF. I think Angus breeders have done a massive job improving carcass traits. There's still heaps of potential to go up a few gears, but I think it could be pretty messy if we start incorporating every possible economic trait. So I look at structure and docility, basically they're threshold traits. So, you should have a minimum threshold, so whether you look at an EBV or an actual score, they're either acceptable in and out. The EBVs are good to look at sire trends, or if you're analysing large progeny groups, they'll have some accuracy and meaning. You can look at them within your own herd, across herd, but definitely just threshold traits, not index traits.
And I've got another question for the panel, and perhaps Dr. Kent Anderson might like to be... Stop tweeting, Dr. Anderson. No, just wondering if we've got, with the information we heard from Dr. Anderson this morning, if we got a better chance of isolating the terrific size that we might have in Australia that might have fallen through the wayside with some of this 50k technology. We saw on that slide that he put up that some of the bulls that never made it actually made it back into the top listing because of the way that they can be tested. Do you think there's potential that we may have missed some terrific size in Australia in the past through, inadvertently, and that they may be out there anyway and we haven't just isolated them? If anyone would like to.
I think that is part of what we've tried to do with the Young Sire program as well, is really to try to identify some of those animals, but for them to become a super bull that really takes the whole breed by storm takes a lot. And I think that is the point that we try to make is we will find some of those animals, but I don't think we should bluff ourselves thinking that this will all of a sudden pick out the best next bull and it will be driving all of that. But it will certainly be a good contributor to that whole system.
Yeah, Harry?
Yeah, I think that's a really balanced view, and it's good to hear that. I think that it's all about getting information and predictability, and that global database is really what drives the Angus breed. So that's why we've made so much success the last 20 years, because we've got a very powerful global database. But it is a really good initiative, that progeny test, because it's potentially also, as Carel said, you're not going to identify 10 bulls that sell semen across the world each year, but you might get one each year or one every second year. And it is quite unique in the sense that it's going to add new information on feed efficiency, which we haven't had. So potentially that will differentiate Australia. I think you've got the Angus Alliance, which ABS involved with in the US, but the Angus project in Australia is a massive, I think trial really by global standards. So it's going to be a good system that adds new information on the size. Like the genomics is going to add accuracy. It's going to get better over time, but you still can't beat basic quantitative genetics. Rely on breeders' performance recording, and that's always going to be the case. And projects like the Angus one, the validation, getting multi-herd tests in different environments with reference size, and it's really what set the Angus breed up, and it's going to continue to do that. So without sort of degrading genomics, they're going to be very powerful. We need to make sure we're still doing the basics, and that's happening in the US. We're going to need all our mates in New Zealand to continue to do the basics. We're going to need all our friends in the US to continue to do the hard yards as well. And I think the other thing about it was Australian bulls, it's not just about genetics. There's a huge research resource in the US. They have hundreds of millions, to spend on production, genomics research. So it's not just about looking up a side directory. Like it's about tapping into their intellectual property as much as I think it's like Nigel. When you go to the US, you learn so much about their production system, about the genetics. They're so open with their R&D. So I think my basic message would be, we need to keep all those doors open. We keep learning. We're challenging our New Zealand guys to step up, and we used to source a lot more genetics from New Zealand, and possibly we've gone different ways because we've had a stronger carcass focus. But I'd like to see New Zealand are still fighting about whether breed plan is still got some debates, and we still have it here. That creates diversity. Differences in opinions are good. Like New Zealand is still going to produce some good cattle, but we have different views on things. We have different views with probably the majority of breeders in the US, but whatever our differences are, they're good for all of us, I guess.
Thanks, Harry. Now we've got a question down the front.
Richard Reid, Acheron, Victoria. I think we should be concentrating on something else that hasn't been fully measured so far, and that's that we should try some tracing of what's happening to the bulls we sell. I think any of my buyers would be startled to hear that the average lifespan of a bull is 2.3 years. I believe that we should really try and get some hard data back from our clients and give them a little inducement or whatever we can. And really, if our 600-day wait keeps rising and rising and rising, I think it's terribly important that we get feedback, and I'd like to see the society be a leader in getting this back.
Carel?
Well, I don't know if I really want to bite at that one, because I fully agree that is a challenge. Of course, again, my first question is, okay, what can we isolate as the causing factor? Is there a specific thing that's causing that? And it almost boiled down to our longevity issue. Is there more stress on the bull, and therefore they go back up in the legs or whatever earlier, and therefore if we increase our longevity on the cow side, will we inadvertently also improve the bulls so that we don't get to point whatever, but perhaps 3 years out of those bulls? And that's some of the questions that's out there that we don't have answers for at the moment. But I think that's fair enough. We would certainly need our members to help us in that regard, because we can't go out to collect that data. But if we can get members that are really starting to engage with their bull buyers and supply us with some of that information, we can certainly start to look at investigating at least what's going on there. But we certainly need members to contribute to that effort.
Just on that note, I do some work for the Irish Cattle Breeding Federation, and they are also, this is a very topical issue in Ireland. There they have a very strict animal traceability system where they have the identification of all the animals in Ireland, commercial animals, whatever, so they know all of the bulls that have come out of pedigree herds and when they've been slaughtered. And I've been involved in analysis of that data We have seen a huge variation in the longevity of what they call stock bulls, the breeding bulls. We have had real trouble trying to pin that down to different sire lines contributing to that genetic variation. We haven't been able to find heritability in that, but it may well be a problem with the data. There's lots of bulls get terminated for various reasons. Maybe they just want it for heifers, and when they get too heavy they get culled or they get sold on. There's a whole bunch of reasons why a lot of bulls seem to get used young and then slaughtered when they've still got some beef value. So that makes it a bit murky, but what the next sort of step in Ireland is to do a survey of a large number of commercial farmers for feedback on specific bulls that they've used. So I can't see that working for Australia as a sort of nationally initiated survey, but certainly a collection of breeders to go out to their clients and gather that sort of data. I think it would be a good starting point. I think other people are also concerned about this issue. Also, sheep breeders in New Zealand, I know, are concerned about exactly this sort of issue.
Mark, question at the back.
Bill Graham, cattle veterinarian, and Bonglong goes to stud Angus. As an adjunct to that, doing a lot of cattle bull breeding follow-up work. A lot of it's to do with the way these bulls are sold, and it's not just their longevity in the herd, it's also their lifelong performance in some of these herds is fairly average in terms of fertility or sub-fertility in those first couple of years due to poor performance, and a lot of it's to do with the growth rate and to the overall size that those bulls are sold into these herds because of feeding practices. That hasn't changed in 30 years as a veterinarian, and I don't see it changing because point of sale is always such about the presentation of bulls.
Anyone care to comment on the panel? Or?
I think that's a very good comment. I don't think I'm going to comment on that one. Thank you. Thanks.
So the argument is the bulls are overfed, and then when they go out to work, they inevitably go into harder conditions, and they're losing condition. They don't work as well. That's the fundamental argument. Yeah.
So the bulls that are overfed, the heaviest fed bulls last the least time in a herd.
Yeah. So that's another thing. That's exactly the same issue in Ireland that is a concern. Yeah.
It's probably even more. It's extreme in Queensland, isn't it? Particularly, like we've obviously got sales up there, and it was an example where we had some bulls in a multi-vendor sale a buyer bought 15 from us, and they were $3,000 cheaper because they weren't fed up, and there was some 900 kilo really beautifully presented bulls, and when they went out, I think he only had 3 out of 15 of the big fat ones in sort of when he pulled them out to, I think it was a couple of months later versus, I think only 3 of ours broke down. But it's a really hard one in Queensland, and it's very slow to change. That's the norm, and it's very hard to change. It's unfortunately very slow.
I've got another question. If I can get Brad. I feel like I'm picking on you, Brad, but that's okay. You're a victim. Brad, just wondering, do you perceive any kind of desire by fellow commercial breeders to use more Australian genetics? Is there any kind of concern about the number of imported genetics that are used in the sire lines that you buy, or do you think that commercial producers are happy to buy whatever bull regardless of its breeding, as long as you're not using similar sire lines the whole time?
I'm pretty keen commercial producer, so we study the genetics and everything we can get online or from our neighbours or from stud producers that we can. But I'd have to say there's a lot of commercial producers out there that just do go along, buy a bull. They just like the look of the bull. They're buying on phenotype, and they've really got no idea. And I'd have to say a lot of them are poorly educated on what they're doing. And sometimes I just shake my head and just talk to them later and say, well, why did you buy that bull? And they just look at you like you're stupid, and they say, well, why wouldn't I? And I say, well, it's got this, that, or the other thing, or that's the same as the bull you bought last year. So I think there's a lot of education could still be done by seed stock producers to inform their clients better. You know what they bought last year, know what they bought 5 years ago, so that you can and know what they're trying to produce, so you can guide them on what they should be purchasing.
Did you see any desire against US or for US, or well, clearly everyone was chasing those two, future direction and new design, several years ago, and that was a very clear buying trend, and you could track that in the sale reports that that those bulls their progeny were performing well.
Yeah, well, no, I do think people have pulled back from that one track. US was the best, and it was the only way we were going to go. But I think people have moderated their not their expectations, but their demands, and they're starting to look more at that female side of the herd, particularly in a self-replacing herd. Yeah.
I've got a question down here. Oh, a good young question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Edward Horton from Orange. My question is to all of you guys. Do you think the Angus breed has lost its type in the way that, you're starting to see Angus breeders breeding cows, that are a bit as big as lowlines and all as cows as big as elephants, Do you think the Angus breed actually has a type, and is it a good thing having so much diversity?
I'll start, and I'm sure that I'll get more takers on that one. In my job, one of the nicest things for me to have is to have all the different members chewing my ear, saying, Carl, we shouldn't do this, we should do that, and we'll get another person just saying absolutely the opposite. And it's great to hear that, because everyone has their own opinion, and that's, I think Harry said it previously, is that creates diversity. And that's what I really like about the whole situation is, and of course, I never turn around and say, no, I think we need to go this or that way, because I know that the different opinions are important, but it's also important for different people serving different areas, different markets, different customers. So it's in a lot of those cases, I just sit back and listen to them, hear what they say, acknowledge that what they say for their situation may be right, but if they really try to push me and convince me, I just say, listen, I've heard what you said, and for your situation it may work, but for some other people it don't. And so that's probably how far I'm going to go with trying to answer your question, and it's not answering it, it's just indicating that I do get that a lot. There's a lot of people that say we're pushing too far in that direction, or we're going too far in that direction, and frankly, I think it's a good thing.
Dick, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, I think genetic diversity is good. I just think, and there is quite a bit of genetic diversity. I suppose the perception in the industry, and certainly in this year's autumn sales, is that if you the most successful sales were what I call the high indexing herds, and that will reduce the genetic diversity, and that's my big worry. The other thing that's interesting, when I came in this industry in the late 70s, early 80s, it wasn't uncommon to go to, the Cooma sales, for example, Bill, you'd see 8 to 10-year-old cows, pens and pens and pens of them for sale. You don't see that anymore. And I know from a pure genetic standpoint that is not where we want to make genetic progress, because it's extending the generation interval. But from a commercial cattleman's viewpoint, if he's going to grow a heifer out to 2-year-old, the longer he can keep that herd in that cow in the herd, if she's producing average or above herd average calves, is less that dollar to grow her out to 2-year-old and get her in full production is amortised over so many more calves. And I've got several commercial clients today that are retaining all their heifers other than their lambs and blinds, and selling their commercial cattle at 5.5, 6-year-old, because they're away from the mentality that we can't retain the heifers. We can retain those heifers, but we've got to move something out. And it's the 5.5 to 6-year-old cows that get moved out. And you've got a story. They've been calved at 2-year-old. They've calved an acceptable calf every year, and they're still in there. And they're worth $300 or $400 above the market rate, because you've got a story with them. Quite often you go to a store sale, the cows that lead the sale off are the females that didn't rear a calf last year. They're about as handy as a hip pocket in your underpants. Okay?
Harry?
Carl, you answered like a typical politician. I think type, like from a genetic point of view, it does, and some of the studs that are more driven by numbers, they're quite often not very good feeders of cattle, like they run higher stocking rates, and I think there's often a confusion between types, actually, probably more related to how much feed you pump into them and environment. And I think most of the show jocks in the industry are very good with animals, present them really well. The guys that tend to be run more on numbers tend to run bigger contemporaries, put cattle under a lot more pressure. They're not interested in, having the big fat cow syndrome. And I'm just amazed at how, like, even we're no different to a lot of you, have been through some tough years. And that CRC research throws up some really good information in terms of it's not only fat that is utilised when these cows are really put under pressure, they'll chew into some serious muscle reserves. So a lot of these cows, you think, oh Christ, look at those crows and this guy's all figures. We're actually putting animals under pretty serious selection pressure. And those same cattle, like I just, as a small example, I'm talking about our own program, but some of the sale cows that came from WA to Victoria, they came off the truck and they looked like scarecrows, and some of them got left on the truck when it blew up for 15 hours on the way over, didn't help. But those cows, say, after the sale, there's been some that we didn't deliver for a few weeks. You look at them under low stocking rate with heaps of feed, you wouldn't think they were the same cattle, and you just fall in love with them. You think, oh, these are magnificent. And the same thing when you see different genetics under different production systems. Most of type is really, and phenotype is feed. So, I mean, we see it all the time in bull sales where you see these beautiful looking bulls and they absolutely blow you away, great shiny coats, and they got all the type in the world. It's all feed. You put those animals, test them under real production systems or run those steers, those progeny through feedlots, they'll perform or they'll calve like their EBVs suggest. There's still some discrepancy about birth weight calving is. Like, you put those bulls under real world, you weigh them, they come out exactly how they, if they're accurate figures, they'll come out exactly how they perform or they're predicted to perform. Their rankings will be 100% virtually correlate with EBVs. The same with growth. So we all love looking at good cows. All of us can see cows with bottle tits, bad feet, wild. So type's a very misused term. I mean, the dairy guys have got a, what do they call it? Dairyness or something. Yeah. So maybe let's get one of those figures. But all it does is take it's that it's said in cows and in bull sales. Phenotype is still the biggest driver, and it's breed plan's been around for nearly 40 years or something. Jeez, I'm getting old. And we're still having these arguments, and you still wonder why beef productivity is down the chute and people in Western Australia are pulling up fences and going into cropping, because we all still argue about type and things that don't have any economic relevance. So you've got to really be conscious if we're going to focus on what our clients need, keep the message on productivity gains, keep it on objective things, and keep all the bullshit out of it, because the other industries where really beef is really struggling to maintain some credibility in terms of an enterprise. The sheep guys kill us. They're making much better gains. They get more lambs. The New Zealand selection indexes on lambs weaning. Those industries are actually running past us very quickly. So the beef guys, and as I said, are probably picking on the northern guys. Opportunities in the north are massive, but the southern systems are probably more focused on. We don't have as many arguments about whether breed plan is relevant in the south, but we still have some debates, but they tend to be, I guess, a bit more focused on the fine tuning rather than whether the system's got any credibility. But as soon as, I go to a bull sale, you travel around the US and people start talking about type, you can pretty much guarantee you pick up their catalogue and they'll have crappy figures. So that's my view on type.
Okay, and now it's about time for us to all stop for afternoon tea. But what I'd like the panel to do, because I haven't quite escaped yet, I'm going to put the question to them again. I would like, please, boys, a yes or no and a one-sentence answer to the question, starting with Peter. So we'll pass the microphone up to Peter. Peter, should we be using more Australian bred Angus genetics? A yes or no and a one sentence.
Yes, because you want to hold your own destiny in your own hands, I guess.
One sentence, Harry.
Yeah, that's right. One sentence, Harry.
Can I have commas?
No. And one breath.
You are.
One breath.
Yes, definitely use more Australian bulls because we've made a lot of progress, and things like the Angus program are going to provide some unique information, but never forget that we live in a global world.
Thank you. Now we've got... It was beautiful, Harry. Never heard you speak so succinctly. Brad?
Well, everybody else said yes. I might as well say no, but I want people to go with what suits their production and what suits their farm.
Nigel, I think I know what you're going to say.
I'll say, like I said before, no. It's not a matter of Australian genetics or American genetics. It's the best genetics, regardless of where they're from, that are going to suit your program.
Carl, a non-technical
Must
one
I say
sentence?
no or yes? I could just say ditto.
You don't have to say no or yes, just...
Well, because it is really about that. It is not about where does the genetics come from. It is how does it suit our production. And I do believe that our systems are now good enough to really identify animals accurately. Sure, we could look...
Carl,
sorry,
that's one.
Okay, that's enough. But I do believe that we should not necessarily look at where they come from.
Now Harry wants to come back. Sorry, Dick.
He wants to be last.
No, you want to ask?
No, I want to ask Carel something after Dick.
And Dick, this will be the challenge. Yes or no, one sentence.
No, genetics from everywhere is good in the Angus breed if it is from herd improving bulls.
Now Harry has one last question.
We've covered a fair bit, but it'd be good to hear Peter and Carl. We haven't talked about the technical aspect. Like, we're assuming things are on an equal footing. Like, there's 100 Angus bulls there, and 87 of them Australian in the top 100. It just seems like a completely, out there. If it's correct, I mean, I can't see how it can be.
Peter?
Can you answer that?
I'm not sure what the question really was, Harry. I'm sorry, but
Well, is it there's 87 or nearly 90% of the bulls in that top 100 are Australian bulls. So
Yeah.
isn't it obvious there's some, there's 300,000 calves in the US? Isn't it pretty obvious there's some technical bias? Or are we really good breeders in Australia?
we're very good breeders in Australia, I think is the answer to that. No, listen, there's many aspects. I can't answer that in one sentence, so I won't attempt to really. But I think what's telling to me is in the top 10 bulls used in Australia last year, there was only 2 from the US, 1 from New Zealand, and the rest were Australian bulls. So I think the situation has changed compared to the days of the heydays of 036 and Future Direction. I think Australian breeders have utilised global genetics very well and got a very good gene pool now, and I agree totally with the comments that we should be using the best genetics globally. We're in a global world these days. We just have to have the tools available to identify the best genetics wherever they come from. But I'll take the opportunity to thank the panel and you, Fiona. Your job's now finished, thanks. But so now I've got the microphone, so could I ask you all to congratulate the panel and Fiona?